Hi, this is Master Ingvar Johannesson from Iceland, and I'm going to show you another game from AlphaZero. I've done videos on 7 of the 10 games published so far, so this is the 8th game that I have a look at. And we have AlphaZero commenting the white pieces, and we see d4 yet again. Seems to prefer d4 or knight f3. e6 by Stockfish, and now knight c3. We haven't seen this before, but after knight c3 the most likely outcome is a transposition into the French defense. So e4, e6, and if we switch to the analysis board, we would most often get this through the move order 1 e4, d4, d5, knight c3, and knight f6. I usually play with the bishop to b4, but knight f6 is the classical variation, and is of course considered just fine for black. Here we see e5 by white. Knight after d7 is more or less forced. White grabs some space with f4. This is all well known. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3, bishop e7. The most common move is a6, followed closely by c takes d4, with ideas of challenge to the center with bishop c5. Excuse me. But we have bishop e7 in this game. Queen d2, a6, the second most common move. Castling is the most common move. And now bishop d3 by AlphaZero. Bishop e2 is the most common move. And now we see Stockfish sort of leave the well-trodden paths. We already have a game with this in 2015 between Caruana and Nakamura. But Stockfish here goes c4. So Stockfish is releasing the tension in the center. And as a French player, usually that's not what you want to do. You kind of want to liquidate the center, so c takes d4 at some point, and trying to break with f6 is the more standard approach in the French. But there are positions where black can play c4 and play for a pawn storm on the queen side, which is precisely what we'll see in this game. But bishop e2, b5. Black wants to play b4, of course, which explains a3. And in an ideal world we play a5 and b4, but we don't have time for that for 2 reasons. Number 1, if we play a5, we're going to hang the pawn on b5. And number 2, if we play a5 and b4, at the end of it you can't take with the pawn because the rook will be hanging. So rook b8 is a necessary move. Now castles. And Stockfish castled as well. a5 was probably also an option. But now we see a strong move by white, f5. Usually when you have the pawn structure like this, pointed in one direction, your most natural pawn break is on that wing to try to open up lines and use your space advantage. So white has a slight space advantage because of the pawns in the center, and he's trying to use it. a5 is consistent, trying to advance on the queen side. White took on e6, recaptures, and now bishop d1. Now what's the point of this move? Well, it's clear that black is ready to play b4, so what do we do with the knight? It turns out that we'd rather have it go to e2 than to d1 or b1. Because on e2 we can go to f4, and from f4 we have some options. We're already targeting e6, and in some cases we can jump to h5, when black really doesn't want to play g6, which will weaken his black squares tremendously. So bishop d1 is a nice move, and we've seen this type of maneuvering skill before from AlphaZero. A takes b4, a takes b4. I'm already reminded of the bishop h1, knight g2 maneuver in the game, in the 100 move game, where he won the pawn on h4. Sort of making way for the knight to go to its best square. So I think we can deduct that white should be better here. In a human game, you know, it doesn't really matter if you're white or black. We would have to think how we would want to clarify the situation on the queen side. Does white want to play c3 to close things up? Does black want to play b3 or c3? And these are things you have to consider in a practical game. And here, Stockfish goes with c3. Now this is a pawn sacrifice. White can take it, which he did. But black didn't recapture. He went for knight b6. And the idea here is knight c4. Try to use this outpost with an attack on the queen. White preemptively, you moved the queen to e1. The knight naturally jumped into c4 and bishop c1. So white has to go a little bit on the back foot because of the pawn sacrifice, but on the other hand, he still has a space advantage, and now he's won a pawn. So black needs to prove something. Stockfish took on c3. Queen takes c3. And white isn't really worried. I mean, the base of the pawn chain on d4 and the potential base on c2 is well protected, and the queen will always have a square if bishop comes to b4. We can move the queen to d3, and that's the only real way to attack the queen. But queen b6 was played, and now black has a threat of capturing on e5. This might work in a human game, but the computer will of course see this right away. This is of course because of the pin of the pawn to the king, so that's why AlphaZero played king h1. No more pin on the pawn, so knight takes e5 is off the table. Knight b2 was played, and white could take on b2 with the bishop. Trade, he's going to be up a pawn, but it seems like AlphaZero didn't fancy his light squared bishop here, and was more willing to give up the light squared bishop than the black squared bishop. So we played knight f4, and we have rook takes d1 and knight takes d1 and rook takes d1. So I want to take a little stock here, and we're once again going to see familiar patterns. The French bishop on c8. It hasn't moved, and already it doesn't have many prospects. It's stuck, protecting the pawn on e6. And where does it go? I mean, on b7, not doing much. a6, it's an open diagonal, but it's you're a little bit pissing into the wind. You know, it's just gonna come back. There's nothing to do there. So we have this recurrent theme of this bad bishop. Now, a little bit later, we're gonna see AlphaZero keep control of the queen side. We have seen that before. Bad bishop, control of one side of the board and attacking on the other. So we're going to see white controlling the queen side and then eventually trying to use the space advantage, which is of course initiated by the advanced pawn on e5 and the pawn chain, which creates the space. And AlphaZero is going to push the pawns on the king side and gain more space. Bishop d7, h4, already starting to think about more space on the king side. And king side is where the game will be decided if it's decided. Rook a8, we see bishop d2. Okay, this protects the rook, but it turns out that the bishop will have a function on d2. Rook after b8. h5, gains more space on the king side. Stockfish took on a1, rook takes, and queen b2. Now here AlphaZero was fine with trading queens, and now c3. And here comes the control on the queen side I talked about. Bishop on d2. For the moment it's going to be passive because it's going to protect c3. But once you protect c3, you protect the whole chain. And since the bishop is already protected by its own piece, it's going to be really hard for black to make any progress here on the queen side. You have to add something to add some fuel to the fire, but you can't at the moment. The knight can't jump to c4 because of the rook. And the bishops don't have a lot of prospects. We already talked about this one. And this one is actually, it's not traditionally bad, but look at the white pawns. They're of course controlling a lot of squares. And the bishop can't go to. And which prospects does this bishop have? So we see again that black has the bishop pair. Normally the bishop pair is good, but the bishops have no prospects in this particular pawn structure in this position. Meanwhile, the white knights, they can maneuver. The knight on f4 is putting pressure on e6, and the knights can maneuver to increase the pressure, depending on the situation. I mean, if we have like h6 and we create a weakness on f6, we can maneuver this knight, go to h2, g4, and f6 as a new square. So very, very positional play once again. Rook a8 check. I mean, some of these moves are a little bit back and forth. Rook b8, but now rook a2. Perhaps AlphaZero is more comfortable with controlling the second rank with the rook. If rook b1 check, which wasn't played, but let's just see. I mean, from here the rook doesn't really do anything. There are no entry squares. Where are you going to go? c1 protected, d1 does nothing. Attack a piece that's protected. This is unavailable. f1 does nothing. So there's nothing to do in the first rank. So it's probably more harmless, the first rank, than the second rank. So rook b3 was played instead. Let's go back to the game. And white continues to expand on the king side. Control on the queen side. Bad bishop. Advance on the king side. Maybe this is a formula you can apply in your own games. Rook a3. And now an instructive moment. Usually we're taught that when you're up a pawn you want to trade pieces. Bring the game closer to an ending, to maybe a pawn ending, and then you try to queen your pawn. But AlphaZero feels like it's gonna need the rook, so rook b2. And I think AlphaZero is absolutely right. And the thing is, the white rook will have more options because of the space. Space advantage also often means that you can swing your forces more easily from one side to the other because you have more space to maneuver. I mean, look at the knights. You can. It's easy to maneuver the knights, you know, whichever way you want to maneuver. If you want to exchange bishops, you can do that. Meanwhile, these guys are sort of just sitting and trying to hold the position without any great prospects. Also note, for the moment, this knight can't move. Well, he can move for the moment, but it can't really do much. Once you land on c4, I will make sure that my bishop is on e1. And your knight, okay, it's better on c4, but you're not threatening anything. King f7, king t2. I still think black should have tried something with knight c4, but of course I'm a human, I'm not a computer. It's just my educated input, if you will, or guess. So okay, bishop c8. We talked about this bishop many times. And sort of its role is in this game has been and will be moving back and forth between d7 and c8 with no prospects. Rook b6, probing a little bit, rook a6, rook goes back, king e8, and now we see that white is starting to make some progress. The king is coming, good endgame principle, activate your king, and white is going to push on the king side. h6, knight g6, a new outpost that was just created. I mean, otherwise white would play g5 himself. If we go back, g5 himself perhaps, and advance whichever pawn he thinks is better. Maybe, you know, maybe even already h6, and if g6, we can start to think about capturing here and move the pawn. So h6, knight g6, rook a3, trying to keep pressure on c3. It's hard to suggest anything for black here because it's a very passive position. Bishop d7, not g5. And this is just to open up on the king side. Eventually you have to make a pawn break to open up there. And the idea is not to take immediately on g5 because we have to take keep control over c3. But we play king g4. One more attacker and then we can take on g5. Bishop d8, rook is attacked so it goes back. Bishop c8 once again. I'm not going to spend more words on this bishop. And knight takes g5. Keeping this bishop and keeping this control here. Shutting down the queen side. Rook a1 was played. Once again, if you want to try this, here it's simply not working because rook b8. And you can have some problems. And now I can even think about swinging the rook over here, which we'll see later as an idea in the game. And knight c4 doesn't do anything because knight c4 I will threaten you with mate. Then I have time to do something about this. So should have made the board green, I'll remember next time. So rook a1, knight f3, stopping the jack here, just keeping control. Rook goes back, bishop e1, still keeping control, still protected. But now we're opening up for the rook to swing across the second rank if we need. Bishop to a5, and now rook f2. This allows black to take on c3, which it didn't do. He played rook a1. So now I'll remember to put on the variation color. So if black takes on c3, I will simply take back. And now our knight is ready to penetrate on f8. So next move we'll play rook f8 check. And from there we can check here on f7 and then pick up the pawn on g7. And this pass pawn on h5 will simply decide the game. So let's go back. Rook a1. We see bishop d2. Black keeps going back and forth. Rook h2, knight e7. Bishop to g5. Knight to f5. And now white gets the trait of the dark squared bishops, which it's usually a good idea if you have a really bad light squared bishop which is hemmed by your pawns and you have pawns on black squares. If you can simplify it down to a knight against a bishop, most of the time you're going to have a really nice outpost somewhere on the board and the bishop will not have any prospects, and we're getting close to that here. Rook b2, keeping the rook dynamic, rook c1 attacking the pawn, and here knight g2 h4, going for this exchange, but allowing black to win a pawn. However, black plays bishop d7. So once again, this pawn on c3 is up for grabs, and black doesn't take it. Why didn't he take the pawn? Because once again, we're penetrating, and this pawn will be lost. And once this pawn is lost, the passer will decide. And the thing, as always, is that the bishop is so bad that it can't help on the queen side, on the king side. It's stuck on the queen side. So let's go back to the game. Bishop d7 was played. Rook b8. Bishop back to c8. And now knight c2. And now finally black takes the pawn on c3. But this has given white time to reroute the knight. And the deciding factor is that eventually black will not be able to protect his pawn on g7. He played rook c1, rook a8, king d7, king f3. You can give a jack here, black can interpose. He can also allow you just to take here, because we can skewer the rook back, so it's not a threat. So king f3 makes it a threat. That's why rook c3 was played. King f2, king e7, trying to get closer to the king side. But white plays a waiting move, king f7, and now knight g6. Now you have to be careful with this king. If you move the bishop, you're actually in a mating net right now, so you have to be careful. King e8 was played. And now rook e1. And again we see this, because of the space advantage, you see how much easier it is for white to swing his forces. And now we have this threat here once again. Black reacts to the threat with rook c7, intending to meet rook f1 with rook f7. But this gives white time to improve the king a little bit. The king comes to g4. And now knight f4. We will see where this knighting is going in a minute. King c8, king g3, biding his time still. Rook e7, and knight d3. And now we see knight wants to jump to c5, an excellent square. King onto b8, rook a6, bishop c8, rook b6 check, and now rook to d6. And now the knight arrives on c5 with devastating effect. And the last time I'll mention this bishop is dead. It has no squares that it can realistically move to. There's great pressure on this e6 pawn. And white's plan is very simple. He's just going to bring the king here up the board, and eventually we can couple the king with the rook swinging around to g8 and simply picking up the pawn. So that explains why Stockfish lashed out here with g6. But this is of course all in vain. You get the h pawn, yes, but you're losing too much material here. I'll take on d5. And okay, finally you got your bishop out. But the bad news is you're down 2 pawns. And this is easily winning. Let's see the remaining moves fast. Knight d3, d5, connected past pawns, that can't be stopped. Rook f8, rook d1 check. Kept giving checks, but I just bring the king back here. And resignation. There's nothing you can do about these pawns. So yeah, another positional crush by AlphaZero. But perhaps in this one, Stockfish didn't play its best. The pawn sacrifice didn't really work. So AlphaZero had an extra pawn to work with for much of the endgame. And even though it was hard to materialize, it just took its time. I think the way it improved the position and made a good knight against the bad bishop was quite instructive once again. And you saw the themes. Bad bishop, even 2 bad bishops really. Shutting down one wing, attacking on the other. Great stuff by AlphaZero. So yeah, that was the 8th game. So only 2 more to go. Hope you enjoyed, guys, and see you later.